To many people, everyday life seems like a prison. Work, home, household problems, loans, and bills are routine, repeated day after day. And there are people who have spent so much time in a real prison that they can't imagine any other life and are more afraid of freedom than bars on their windows and guards. We tell the story of Paul Heidel, who has been behind bars for almost 69 years, the last 8 at his own will. Heidel is a classic example of an unhappy man who conceived of solving all problems once and for all. Surprisingly, he succeeded. He was born on April 21, 1894, in Hartford, Connecticut. The German immigrant family was not wealthy. The boy's father, Paul Heidel Sr., owned a saloon and, like many of the regulars in his establishment, was a heavy drinker. In 1900, Heidel Sr.'s body could not withstand the constant binge drinking, and the man died. History is silent as to whether the mother abandoned her son or whether something happened to her as well. Whatever the case, the boy lived in an orphanage until he was 14. He was small and frail, so after the orphanage he decided to seek his place under the sun in the service sector and started working part-time as a bellboy in hotels and as a waiter in restaurants. However, things did not go well here either. The guy got a job at one hotel or another, but quickly lost his job. In 1911, Heidel managed to get a job at the newly opened The Hotel Rector on 44th Street in New York City. The hotel of the famous hotelier, restaurateur, and cookbook writer George Rector was famous for its luxurious interiors, and the restaurant was very popular among big businessmen and bohemians. Here Heidel met William Henry Jackson, 73, a highly successful financier who often dropped in for dinner at the Rector's and lived in the luxurious apartment Hotel Iroquois Hotel, where Paul worked before taking a job at the Hotel Rector. It is not known at what point Heidel got the idea to rob Jackson. Apparently, it happened when the landlord of the apartment where he was renting a room bought a bottle of chloroform to put a seriously ill dog to sleep. The young man then wondered, as if in jest, how much chloroform it might take to put a grown man to sleep. He was helped into the hotel by Patrick McGrain, a bellhop who lived in the same house as Heidel, and to whom he had promised a share of the untold riches from the elderly financier's room. Heidel went to the bed on which Jackson lay, retrieved a bottle of chloroform stolen from the landlady, splashed the liquid over a handkerchief, and pressed it to the elderly man's face. He expected that in a few seconds the financier would lose consciousness and it would be possible to rummage thoughtfully through his belongings, but it was exactly the opposite. Jackson immediately jumped up, started screaming and fighting back. Heidel acted further on instinct. He pounced on his victim and tried to gag him, but he clearly overdid it out of fear. The chloroform-soaked handkerchief ended up in Mr. Jackson's throat, and he died. The worst part was that the murdered William Henry Jackson's hotel room was devoid of any enormous assets. The booty was $6.50, a wristwatch, and a pair of silver cufflinks. Heidel left the room and returned home, to the very apartment where he had lived with Mac Rain, in full confidence that he would not be found. Moreover, at the scene he had left shards of the chloroform bottle that had broken during the fight with Jackson. But the NYPD worked flawlessly. It was the chloroform bottle that became the key piece of evidence. They used the label to find out where it had been bought, and the pharmacist told them who he had sold the chemical to. 2 days after the murder, Heidel and McRain were picked up at home. During the investigation, Paul was wearing a new suit. It was the only thing the murder money was enough for. Heidel did not deny it, nor did he try to confuse the police. He recounted in great detail how he accidentally killed Jackson and revealed the uncomplicated motives that drove him to the crime. "When I worked at the Iroquois Hotel, I always wanted nice clothes, but I didn't have enough money for them," Heidel told the interrogation. "There were perfectly dressed people walking around, and I wanted to look the same. They had nice shirts with padded collars and lots of cool stuff." The court sentenced a young robber loser to 20 years in prison for second-degree murder. Paul was sent to the notoriously harsh Sing Sing prison to serve his sentence. He later recalled his time at Sing Sing as the worst time of his life. By 1926, Heidel was well on his way to parole. His record was excellent, and the administration quite sincerely believed that the Iroquois Hotel murderer had truly rehabilitated himself. But his hopes for parole collapsed when a panel of prison psychiatrists ruled that Heidel was insane. This story is very strange because during the investigation and trial Heidel was completely open and talked to dozens of police officers, investigators, and specialists. None of them noticed any signs of insanity. Even before Jackson's murder, no mental problems had been observed in him. Heidel was transferred to the prison for the criminally insane in Dannemora, where a new life began. In 1929 he again applied for parole, but was denied. He ended up spending 46 years at Dannemora until it closed in 1972. Apparently, he was simply forgotten. After the closure of Dannemora Correctional Facility, Heidel was transferred to Fishkill Prison's senior prisoner unit. In the new place of confinement, conditions did not resemble those of a prison, rather, it was a nursing home with rooms instead of cells. Its residents were free to walk around the block, watch television, socialize, and play board games. In 1973, Burton Schoenbach, a former member of the New York State Corrections Oversight Commission, who, upon his retirement, took up the cases of prisoners serving long sentences, took an interest in Paul Heidel's fate. Schoenbach discovered that Heidel had been behind bars for more than 60 years, for which there was no reason after his basic 20-year sentence ended in 1931. He decided to inquire about the situation and came across attempts by prison authorities to silence the situation. The parole board was just lying through their teeth, he described the situation to the New York Times in January 1974. A human rights activist began campaigning for the elderly prisoner's release, created a media scandal, and for the first time since 1929, a parole petition for Heidel was accepted for consideration. In August 1974, the commission finally decided to release him. But then a very unexpected event happened for those who had fought for his freedom. Heidel refused to leave prison. Officially released after 63 years in prison, Heidel begged the Fishkill administration to keep him in prison. He had no one on the other side of the bars. There were no relatives left, no acquaintances. The only things the ex-con could count on were a municipal corner in some dysfunctional neighborhood, a tiny old-age pension, and the need to survive in a world he didn't know at all. Once free, he might well have repeated the sad fate of Brooks Hatlin in Escape from Shawshank, who had spent 50 years in prison and killed himself soon after his release. It is quite possible that Stephen King heard about Heidel's fate and decided to imagine what would have happened to such a man outside the prison walls. Paul Heidel lived another 6 years in prison. Officially, he was not an inmate, but he was kept there for humanitarian reasons. And then, too, many of the Fishkill staff became friends with the old man. He was no longer subject to any restrictions, and on weekends he went to baseball games with his jailers. In 1980, he was finally persuaded to leave the walls of the penitentiary and move to an ordinary nursing home. A large crowd of journalists and Guinness World Records representatives gathered in front of the prison gates as Heidel was officially recognized as the man who had served the longest term in American history, 68 years and 296 days. But the emotional meeting with freedom didn't work out. "Forget about me. No fuss, please," he briefly interrupted reporters' attempts to question him about his impressions. Then he got into the car sent for him and drove off to a nursing home in Dutchess County, New York. Heidel's dubious record lasted until 2021, when Francis Smith, who had spent nearly 72 years in prison for murder, was released in Connecticut. However, Smith, unlike Heidel, had escaped in 1975, so the authorities had a formal reason to keep him in prison. The main mystery of Heidel's story is that he was declared insane in 1926. To all who interacted with him, he gave the impression of being a very reasonable and well-mannered man. His handshake was firm and his mind clear and sharp, a New York Times reporter described meeting him in 1974. Perhaps his years in Sing Sing did damage his sanity, but it is more likely that he was simply a victim not only of his own desire to enrich himself, but also of a penitentiary system that rarely pays attention to people who have no intercessors.